Hello, everyone. Hi. Hello. Hi. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Hi. And good afternoon. Thank you for your company. And as I was standing at the back, I'm looking at this, and is this a headstone? Am I being featured on a headstone? Well, you know, one hopes not. Well, we have this is the first, as we've just heard, of a two-part series, America, by the book. And this is America by the book is part of a larger series in which I, roll out 6 or 7 different novels. But what we've done is we've cherry-picked Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and next week we're going to go to the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, and Steinbeck's the Grapes of Wrath, and that's a good read, and that's a good discussion piece as well. Now, I don't know whether or not that this might be urban legend. I mean, this might be an apocryphal story. Whether or not when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he actually said, "So you're the little lady that started this great war." I'm not sure he said that. It might be apocryphal, but he did meet her, and if he did say it, it's not correct. That this war was not inevitable, but there was quite a run-up, to the outbreak of the war between the states in April of 1861. And Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel did play an important part, in beginning to kind of push the country towards some sort of a confrontation. And by the way, I used the phrase the Civil War, didn't I? Now, it's safe for me to say this in Carlisle, Massachusetts. I mean, the People's Republic of Massachusetts, that I can say that. If I'm in Virginia, I had better use the phrase the war between the states. You've heard me say that. And if I'm in the Deep South, if I'm Mississippi or Alabama, I had better say the war of northern aggression. Because you Yankees, you damn Yankees, brought this on. And what we did is we seceded peaceably, and you chased us out of the Union. That being said, there were 3 in the pre-war, in the antebellum period, which is a kind of a dressed up way to talk about the pre-war country till 1865. There were 3 major questions that the nation addressed and struggled with in the years immediately following the American Revolution, or the Revolution itself. And one was the question over whether or not to actually seek independence. And we tend to think, don't we? We tend to think that was automatic, that everybody was arm in arm and hail fellow well met. Not at all. That was an enormous question that convulsed the country. And then a second major question during the antebellum period, I'm getting to Stowe right now, and one more. The second question was the drafting of the Constitution, whether or not we ought to have a strong national constitution. And that was a bitter, bitter verbal battle as well, and that's Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Papers. And for you, and for today, for this afternoon, it is the issue of slavery, abolitionism, and whether or not, as Lincoln said, not in 1852 when this book was published, but he did say later on, that this nation cannot exist. This nation cannot exist divided. A house divided against itself cannot stand. That we cannot be half slave and half free. That it's got to be one or the other. And so it will be Mrs. Stowe who will help to energize that question. And that is the question in the 1850s, half slave and half free. And the question of abolitionism, the morality of slavery, and what can the nation do about slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe was the wife of a minister. And her dad had been a minister, and she was brought up somewhere, I always like to say this, Stowe was brought up somewhere between the Bible and the dictionary. In other words, she had such a strong religious impulse growing up, very religious, and this is going to factor into the close of the novel. And let me tip my hand right here, that Uncle Tom is a black Christ, isn't he? I mean, Uncle Tom is a sacrificial black Christ. I'll get to that at the very end. It closes our novel. So she was quite a religious woman, and she married a minister and had time in between producing, and that was the verb back then, to produce children. The marriage produced, you know, like, well, you can, whatever, however you want to use that verb. You know, that the marriage produced 7 children, or she was one of 13, so one can deal with that as you like. And she produced, you know, 6 or 7 children, and it's hard to imagine, you know, where she found the time or the energy, you know, to be able to write such a shattering novel that sold hundreds of thousands of copies, was translated into dozens of languages, and led to Harriet Stowe, you know, having a price put on her head if she showed up below the Mason-Dixon line, and also that this book was burned. Let me back up for a minute. This was a reading republic. I mean, this was a highly educated reading country, and there's no social media. This book was the social media, wasn't it? And she began to think about the book, and she wrote the conclusion of the book before she filled in the beginning of the book. And when it was picked up by a publisher, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment, that she had a choice, she and her husband. You know, we can either take 10% of we can take 10% as royalties, and we can take royalties now, 10% of the royalties now, or we can cash in on month by month on the sales value of this book. It was an international bestseller. I'll tell you why in a little bit. An international bestseller, and she made a bad deal. She should have gone with the profits as they came in over the years. She took her 10% and ran, and was unable to renegotiate the contract. She needed a good attorney. Right? She was too quick to settle.
Had she ever written any books before this?
She's going to write books afterwards. I'm going to get to that, right? None of which ever captured the attention, or ever captured the imagination, or the country, if you will. I mean, today books still play an important role, don't they, in helping to shape public opinion. And I'm always reminded when I say that of Al Gore's book 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you know, An Inconvenient Truth. Wonderful title, isn't it? I happen to think global warming is occurring, and I know that I'm part of it. I know. I mean, I put a lot of hot air into every room, and I know I do. But Al Gore hasn't identified, he hasn't outed me. Or Al Gore doesn't know that I'm part of the problem. It's all being based on emissions, but I'm part of the problem. But An Inconvenient Truth is one of these books that informs public opinion. The Feminine Mystique was a book in the 60s that helped to inform public opinion. And Uncle Tom's Cabin set the bar for all of these books. And when Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this book, what forced her hand, her religious hand, and the hand of her sister-in-law, who wrote to her and said, "Harriet, you have such writing skills. If I had your skills, and if I had your deep," is that her calling? If I had her, if I had your sense of religiosity, that I would cast this book that only you could write in deep religious tones, that slavery is offensive to the Lord, and it's immoral, and it needs to be addressed, and it needs to be corrected. You see, there was among many Southerners, among many Northerners rather, the belief, and we need to bring the history in, of a slave power conspiracy. Americans love conspiracies, don't they? And who knows what lurks in Area 51? A slave power conspiracy. And that slave power conspiracy, directed from the White House, from the courts, from the Congress. And that conspiracy was to spread slavery across the entire country. into the territories and across the entire country. And what added to that notion of a slave power conspiracy in the aftermath of Stowes' publication was the Dred Scott decision. Now, the Dred Scott decision in 1857, slavery, it appeared as if the court had ruled, Roger B. Taney, that slavery was national, that it could go anywhere into the territories, and it perhaps begged the question that even if a Massachusetts or a New York had abolished slavery, perhaps the Supreme Court, Article 6 of the Constitution, the Supremacy Clause, that slavery could go national, and that no states could deny slave property in their state. So this was all part of this conversation that helps to move toward the war between the states. There were a number of forms, if you will, brands of abolitionism. One, William Lloyd Garrison, who lived and wrote not too far from here, that he talked about immediatism. That the only way to deal with slavery is to deal with it promptly, to declare it immoral, and to simply break with slavery. And the best way for enslaved persons to be free was to be free. And rather than prepare them for freedom, the best way to be free is to be free. And the argument against that, 95% of enslaved Africans could neither read, write, or cipher. And simply to turn them loose, without preparation, both for black Americans, white Americans, would be a disservice. And that he's simply being too abrupt here. And for William Lloyd Garrison, and Stowe knew Garrison, for William Lloyd Garrison, I would rather dissolve the Union than have the Union also contaminated by slavery. Break with the South. Now that's Garrison. Break with the South. Let them go. Slavery is toxic. It will contaminate all of us. And there are others who had the opinion that we need to have it done gradually. Pick a date. It's called gradualism. Pick a date. I don't mean you pick a date, but Congress pick a date. July 4th, 1855, or January 1, 1855. There were a couple of dates that were out there, and what would happen is that the legislation never came to pass, but the way it would have worked with gradualism is we pick a date. And I'll give, let's say, July 4th, 1845. And that every black child born after July 4th, 1845, upon reaching the age of 21, would be henceforth and forever free. So getting the country ready for that. And then there were, another point of view that talked about recolonization. That send everybody back to Africa or a colony in the Caribbean. And Lincoln early on, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, that Lincoln early on supported recolonization. I mean, that Lincoln believed in the economic equality of black men and women, but certainly not the social equality. So all of these ideas are out there and are on the front burner, and they're boiling. They're at a high temperature. And in 1850, the end of the Mexican-American War, and this is what's going to galvanize Harriet Beecher Stowe. In 1850, the end of the Mexican-American War, and if you were supporting the concept of a slave power conspiracy, that this is a Southern plan to extend slavery throughout the country, President Polk was the president, Tennessee slaveholder. The two primary generals who waged and won the war against Mexico, and this is General Scott, Winfield Scott of Virginia, Southern, Zachary Taylor, Louisiana, and 2/3 of the troops, that fought in the Mexican-American War were Southern boys. The United States, rather Massachusetts, refused to send troops. That this is part of a slave power conspiracy. So if you're stepping back, slave power conspiracy, this was a war, that was engineered by a Southern president, won by Southern generals and Southern soldiers, and the Compromise of 1850 And this is what energized Stowe. The Compromise of 1850, which ended the war and laid out where slavery could go in the territories and where it could not go, contained a clause. It was called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1855. And the Fugitive Slave Act put the government, the federal government, in the business of helping slave catchers identify, recapture, and return runaways to the South. Now, there had been in the Constitution, and you know I don't leave home without it, it's always here, that in the original draft of the Constitution, there was what was called a rendition clause. In other words, that slaveholders, by the way, the word slavery does not appear in the Constitution, does it? The euphemism is people bound to labor, people bound to service. Even the framers, 2/3 of whom or a quarter of whom were slaveholders, were a little skittish about including that word in the language of the Constitution. So they used euphemisms, a rendition clause. The English language is sweet, isn't it? With the ability to use euphemisms. I mean, no one's ever out of work. They're in between jobs, aren't they? They're in between jobs. No one ever dies. They've gone to the other side. Yeah, but you owe me money. Where can I find you on the other side? And you're in between jobs, Dad. I need a little help with the rent. I'm in between jobs. Here we go. Here we go again. As a parent, as you know this, we are the eternal ATM machine. I mean, it never goes away. Right? There's always a cha-ching somewhere. The Fugitive Slave Act put the national government in the business of helping slaveholders recover, arrest, and return runaways. Massachusetts, New York, it hardly mattered. And for ardent abolitionists, this was so immoral and criminal that the powers of the federal government are being used to help to protect, extend, and to enliven slavery. And for Harriet Beecher Stowe, pardon me? Assets, yeah. I mean, for Harriet Beecher Stowe, that maybe we need no union with slaveholders. And I need to write a book. And from that came Uncle Tom's Cabin. This cabin. He lives in a cabin. That's all that he has, but it's his cabin. It's Uncle Tom's. A free man, maybe. It's Uncle Tom's cabin. And the irony is, and I know you remember this, you know, during the 1960s, you know, when the civil rights movement, you know, moved from words to violence, you know, moved from the pulpit, you know, into the streets, that, you know, Martin Luther King was condemned as an Uncle Tom, wasn't he? You know, that you're black on the outside, you know, but you're white on the inside, and that you're an Uncle Tom. And folks who made that charge, it was so erroneous. I mean, it was just bad history. I mean, that Uncle Tom, the reason Uncle Tom was beaten to death at the end of the novel is that he refused to reveal to Simon Legree, you know, the slaveholder, he refused to reveal the whereabouts of slaves who had fled from the plantation. He knew where they were. You know, they were in the swamps or in the bayous. They were hanging out. They were looking to try to follow that North Star to freedom. And he refused to reveal their whereabouts, that he is a martyr to freedom. And that was all missed by these abolitionists who were absolutely unwilling to deal with slavery, or later on, you know, these people in the streets, that Martin Luther King, and anybody that wants to work with Whitey, you know, that you're an Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom was not an Uncle Tom. He died being beaten. And at the close of the book, I'm going to talk about how the book changed things, but at the very close of the book, and this book was illustrated, by the way, and if you look at some of the original copies, the very close of the book has an illustration. Uncle Tom on his knees, trying to get up, and you can see the blood dripping from his skull and being beaten by Simon Legree, and Uncle Tom extending his arm toward Legree and asking the Lord, forgive him. Forgive him. He knows not what he does. Father, forgive him. This is not an Uncle Tom. This is a guy who I'm not revealing the whereabouts of these runaways. They're young enough to run. I'm not young enough to run anymore. Run, Thomas. Run, Thomas. Run, Elizabeth. Run, Elizabeth. I'm too old to run, but I will make the sacrifice. So Stowe begins to put her piece together. And what she does, it's one thing. You see, it's one thing to go to a church service or a religious service or to an auditorium and listen to an abolitionist speaker condemn the poor economy of slavery. In other words, that free labor is much more productive than slave labor. Or to go to an abolitionist meeting and the immorality of slavery. To go to an abolitionist meeting and condemn slaveholders as being without God. That the Lord does, and boy, did this get slaveholders crazy when Garrison, the Lord does not hear the prayers of your children. The Lord's ears are deaf to the prayers of your children. You are immoral, and there will be a necessary judgment of you. They want to hear that. It's one thing to listen to that and to have some of these women come up and speak. For Southerners, women were very instrumental in the abolitionist movement because they saw the abolition of slavery as being part of their road to freedom as well, to vote, you see. I mean, the two were commingled here. And women very active in the abolitionist movement and speaking, getting to the podium and speaking. And for many Southerners and Northern men as well, that what kind of a man, what kind of a husband would allow his woman to speak publicly and to wear these bloomers, figure-hugging bloomers, so that she could step proudly up to the stage without having to maneuver, this skirt, that was 85 times too wide for her, that she had to maneuver and be helped up the stairs, that she could stride to the stairs, stride to the stage, take the podium. My goodness, what kind of a man would allow a woman to do that? We don't allow that in the South. Our women are on pedestals. Maybe. See, this is always true. Many times the truth doesn't matter, right? It's irrelevant. It's immaterial. It's perception, isn't it? And how you spin the story. It's perception. And oftentimes truth takes a very back door or doesn't even get in the front door. It's perception. And the longer you tell a lie, the truer it becomes. If it's loud, repetitive, bang, bang, bang. What Stowe did is that she put a face in this novel. It's a long novel, you know this, and it can be preachy, and it can be melodramatic, and at least as far as I know, unless you are an English major in 19th century American lit, I don't think this book gets read in the high schools anymore. Anybody help me here? I mean, it used to be. It's just like Moby Dick, went the way of the albatross, huh? Moby Dick's a great novel. It's a great novel, and it does a lot of different things. It doesn't get read anymore. And I don't think Uncle Tom's Cabin is part of the curriculum, certainly in high school anymore. I know The Crucible is, which is a great window on Puritan New England, and it still is today. By the way, that's part of one of the books that I do, America by the Book. We do The Crucible, because you can blend into that. You can ladle into that so much about Puritan life and Puritan theology and the mythology of Puritanism. She gave a human face to slavery. She gave the slaves names. She named them. So this wasn't some antiseptic, peculiar institution being addressed from the podium. She gave them names, personalities. And what she used for the very first time, and this was so dramatic, and so inviting as a reader the slave dialect, that she used black dialect. And so this was brand new. I mean, this was cutting edge stuff. Dialect, names, framed the story around, well, she framed the story also around the miscegenation. In other words, I mean, the planter, the owner, and his children going down to the slave quarters and miscegenation. In other words, this is property, and I can have my way sexually with my property. That's part of that story as well. And depending on what state you're in, and if you read the old law books, that there was no, that if a son, had a sexual encounter with a female slave, it was never rape. It was trespassing on my property. I mean, I'm not trying to be insensitive here, but it was trespassing. It's my property. And slave was property, chattel property. And chattel is the old biblical term for cattle. Cattle to chattel, chattel to cattle. I own property. And that property, and this is part of that story, because she talks about a slave auction. And she talks about and writes about when the owner has died and the estate is being broken up, and everyone and everything appears on the front lawn to be bid on. A horse, a carriage, a young girl, or a young man. It's property, chattel property, and to be traded, to be used as collateral for a loan, to use to pay off a debt, to gamble, that one could. I'm doubling down. Sarah's on the table. I've run out of cash, but I'm doubling down on the book value of Sarah. Not to be offensive, but that's the way it was. That's antebellum slavery, the peculiar institution. And by peculiar, that's the Southern term. By peculiar, they didn't mean odd. They meant peculiar to the South. This is part of our civilization. This is the way we do business here. This is the way we make our money. And the notion of property even went into the writing of a will. If I'm a slaveholder, and what I can do in my will, that I can designate Nancy's. Most slaves had only a first name. You didn't need a last name. I mean, you didn't. You weren't getting any phone calls, and you weren't getting any mail. You just had a name. One did not need a surname. So what I could do as a slaveholder, I could say Nancy, who at 14 is just perhaps becoming of age to produce children. And I can will Nancy's firstborn to my neighbor because I owe him money. Or to the bank owner, and I can close the loan down. I mean, that's the institution, slavery. And what Harriet Beecher Stowe does is that she presents us with a slave auction. She presents us with the breakup of an estate. And she begins her story. Now, where does she get her material? She spent 2 days, maybe 3. She spent some time in Cincinnati, a slave state. And slavery, slavery in Kentucky going over the river. Not going over the river, the Ohio River. And that's why the Ohio River plays a role in her novel. That she spent 2 or 3 days on a plantation in Kentucky. And that, she drew, just visually, she drew the visual image, and the working and the people and the certainty of violence. The only way to maintain control was the absolute certainty of violence. And she saw that. And yet in Kentucky, the Kentucky form of slavery was very benign. See, the Upper South, from Virginia, Maryland to Delaware, we tend to forget that Delaware was a slave state. Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, Missouri, that this was the Old South. And slavery was dying out because the land was being exhausted. And cotton in particular is it robs the soil of nutrients. So what was happening in the Upper South is there was a brisk slave trade from plantations in the Upper South to plantations in the New South where the land was being broken, in Mississippi, Alabama, in Georgia. And this is virgin land, new land to expand slavery, to expand tobacco, to expand sugarcane, grain, and to move it right to the West Coast, you see. She gets some visuals in Kentucky, and she also, obviously read anti-slavery pamphlets, and she also read a book by a manuscript by Theodore Weld of Massachusetts, a reverend. And what he did is he put together a compilation of the ads for Runaways. The ads for Runaways, ads that appeared in the Louisiana Picayune, if you will. Ads. And she plucked information from these ads. And these ads would describe the physical characteristics of runaways. And these ads would advertise for the runaways in ways such as, I branded Mary with an M on her cheek. It's a little messy because she moved, missing a toe. Missing, because one way to begin to minimize runaways would be to take a toe off, to take the big toe off, because you can't run if you're missing your big toe. You can't run as well as you could run a 100-yard dash, or they have gunshot wounds, or they have whip marks and keloid scarring. And we've seen the photographs of keloid scarring. In other words, raised scarring on the back and running like a river system on your back. And so these descriptions she picked up. And guess what? When Southerners began to realize that abolitionists were being able to address the brutality and the violence of slavery through ads for runaways, the ad for the runaway became very general, didn't it? Black, male, maybe 30 years old. I'm looking for him. And there will be a reward. The Fugitive Slave Act, that if you captured a runaway, there was a reward. And when folks ran into Massachusetts and slave catchers were in the area, there were signs on the sides of buildings and so forth, slave catchers in the area. Here's the phrase that would be used. We don't use this phrase today. Keep top eye open. Now, if you're a black guy, a black woman, watch out. Be careful. They're here. And stay out of sight. If you go to Beacon Hill, and maybe you've done this, there are little escape trails on Beacon Hill, and because blacks lived at the bottom of Beacon Hill, was where the black community was. And if you go to Beacon Hill, and you're up by the State House, and you come out sort of the back door of the State House, that there are little trails running down through the neighborhoods, down to Commercial Street. It's a shortcut, down to Commercial Street, down to the waterfront, and they're very narrow, maybe even not even this wide, and just to run quickly. And if you walk down them, you can look right into somebody's bedroom, right into their kitchen, right into their bathroom, because they've built up to them and they're protected because they're part of the National Historic Site. So you go down, you go down there, and hey, you're on the John, huh? So, and one can do that. It's a great shortcut right down to Commercial Street. But most people don't do that. And the phrase we do use today, while we might not use the phrase, keep a top eye open, the phrase we do use is to be sold down the river. And to be sold down the river meant to be sold down the Ohio, the Mississippi, down to the New South, where they were breaking new land for new crops, to be sold down the river, down to New Orleans. And this is Uncle Tom is sold down the river from the rather benign, kindly master in Kentucky, where the violence was minimal, the work was manageable, and one was not worked to death or beaten to death. And that even, and this is Stowe, showing even under the most benign circumstances, how wretched slavery can be. Suddenly the master dies, the owner dies, and the estate is being broken up. And it's like a yard sale. or tag sale. What do you have up here? Yard sales or tag sales? Both, huh? Okay. And everything's out on the lawn. And you come up and you buy and you buy and you buy and you buy. And if you're sold down the river to the slave pens, and you're put up for auction, and you're examined. And you always examine the teeth. It's like a forensic examination. You know, the age and the health, the teeth. And if you're a slave, if you're a slave driver and you're selling, you want to make sure that if you've got a little black ink, you take care of that gray hair, and you gin them up a little bit, make them happy, make them dance, make them sing, if you will. And as Harriet Beecher Stowe tells us in her novel, families are broken up. You know, father is sold here, mother is sold there, the children are separated. And this is so wrong, so immoral. It's so offensive. And to break up families. So she's talking about the auctions, the breakup of families, that even under the most benign conditions, Kentucky, that families are broken up, slaves are sold away. We can't do this. We can't do this anymore. The whole Western world is moving toward a more benign and sensitive view of mankind, of humankind. Great Britain abolished slavery in the empire in the 1830s. France followed in its empire in the 1840s. And that, you know, we are still one of the last slaveholding major nations in the Western Hemisphere. Even in Russia, Alexander II or the Third, I can't tell the difference, they look the same, second or third, that serfdom was abolished. Now I know that serfdom wasn't slavery, but nonetheless, serfdom was abolished, and we still have this peculiar institution. So names, faces, dialect, situations. One of the major episodes of the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the major episodes, and this was carved out of the book, and became part of a traveling show, you know, where you invite people into the big tent, come in and see a scene from Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this was a classic scene. It stands alone and one can read it. You know, it's Elijah, you know, running with her children, you know, over the Ohio River, fleeing to Canada with her children, and being pursued by slave dogs. And there were slave dogs who would hunt down runaways. And so this scene in the big tent, and it would be the recreation of Elijah with the children holding them by the hand and running across the frozen Ohio River, you know, with the slave catchers and the slave dogs, you know, in hot pursuit. And the audience, it's not even if you're an abolitionist. It began to grow, the number of abolitionists, but people cheering and cheering for Elijah to make it. Run, 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 Elijah. Take your children, run, 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 go girl, if you will, to use a modern phrase. Run, run, run. You know, and booing the slave catchers as they tried to pick their way across the Ohio River, fearing of falling through the ice and being drowned. And for Elijah, I'd rather be drowned with my children. I don't have time to worry. Will it support me? Run, run, run. And cheering her and booing the slave catchers. It was electric. I mean, to be there, to see it. It's one thing to read about something, but to be in the room and to see it and to be part of the chase. And you may not become an abolitionist. Say, by God, this is wrong. If this isn't wrong, nothing is wrong. Now, abolitionists were always a minority in the North, and certainly even more of a minority in Massachusetts. That abolitionists were seen as being bad for business, bad for trade, bad for peace, bad for, well, we have the cotton mills, New Bedford, don't we? New Bedford, Fall River, Lawrence and Lowell, down in Providence. And the entire country benefited from the peculiar institution. And so they're spinning that cotton into cloth, aren't they? And I know this is true, and if you've been up to Lawrence and Lowell, you know, cotton was graded, you know, like tobacco. And tobacco was graded, cotton was graded. And the lowest grade of cotton was called Negro Cloth. And that was the lowest grade of cotton. And that cotton would be spun into well, that cotton will be spun into thread, and that once a year, and all you need to do is read Frederick Douglass and his narrative, the first one, and you can read it at a red light. He wrote 3, but I always like to use the first one because he wrote it maybe 7 years after he had escaped. The other 2 were years later, so the stories get thinner, the details become elusive. You know, who was there, who wasn't there. You know how it is. You're trying to remember something 35 years ago, and who was there, you know, what was said, and who said what to whom. It's hard to recover those details. Speaking of who said what to whom, yeah, it's hard to recover those details. And one of my favorite activities is when people are showing me an old wedding album about who said what to whom and who was there. What I like is when there are the photographs and there are people with their heads cut off, you know, sitting at the head table. I want to know that story, all right? Why are their heads missing? And you know there's a story there, isn't there? And I said, I want to hear about that story. That's what I want to hear about. So, cheering for Elijah. Negro Cloth. In fact, Negro Cloth, I'll take a little side trip for a minute. When the war between the states broke out, and I prefer that term, that uniform manufacturers, North and South, received very generous government contracts to make uniforms for Northern soldiers, obviously. And they used this poor quality of cotton. But it wasn't called Negro Cloth. And here's a word we still use today. It was called Shoddy, something that's a shoddy product, and it was shoddy. And so we're making these, we're getting a good buck from the United States government, you know, to make uniforms for Union soldiers with shoddy cloth. And we're using a poor quality material, and we're getting top buck. So the word shoddy is a poorly made product. And it was a poorly made product. In the rain, the jacket would come apart, or the boots. When the boots were made, I mean, when the boots were made, they were not made left foot or right foot. You simply bought the boot, and the more you marched, the more calloused and bloody and sore your feet were. But over time, the boot was reconfigured to fit your left foot and your right foot. You just have to walk in it long enough. So the brand of cotton, if you will, picking out certain scenes. A runaway bestseller. If she had taken profit, she would have made a fortune. She didn't know the business. How could she? Now, how did this play out in the South? How did this play out in the South? Now, she hoped that when Southerners read this, that, she had a number of goals. One, to point out how immoral the institution was and breaking families apart. And also hoping to show that, at least in some situations, slavery could be somewhat benign, depending on the master. And all that did was play into the abolitionists. You see how unpredictable it is? You know, that there's not one type of slavery. You know, it depends on the master to the owner, to the slave. It changes from state to state. It changes from town to town. And if there's an overseer involved, you know, whose job it was to make sure we make certain, we hit certain production markers, you know, that was another variable as well. But she hoped to show that, yes, there are benign masters. And she hoped to mitigate the more radical of the abolitionists. So we need to break. No, we don't want to break. You know, we don't want to dissolve the Union. William Garrison, no union with slaveholders, that's not a solution. We need to solve the problem, you know, rather than break with the problem and amputate the country. We need to remember the work of the framers here. Boy, did they hate her. You know, again, it goes back to what I said a few minutes ago. What man? I'll tell you what kind of man, a northern man, a man who doesn't wear the pants in the family, a man who gets run around by his wife. And we don't want any part of that society. These weak men being bossed around by their wives, allowing this to happen. We have no interests in modeling our future after them. And this book will be burned. It is false. We love our slaves. We take care of our slaves. And if you had been on a plantation long enough, Missy, you're not a Missy. If you'd been on a plantation long enough, Missy, you would have been around in the evening, particularly on a Saturday evening when the slaves came up from the quarters to the big house and they serenaded us, you know, and without even a pitch pipe, whoop, they could hit it and they would serenade us. They love us, and it is a benevolent institution. It is a positive good. Without us, and if they lived in the free North, they would be without jobs. They would be without food. They would be without housing. They would be without any medical care. We take care of our people. They love us. This is a benevolent institution. They are but grown-up children. They laugh and sing and dance, but we take care of them. We take care of them. And you Northerners, you hypocrites in New Bedford, Fall River, and we're at Pawtucket, when there's a downturn in the economy, what do? You turn your workers loose, don't you? You fire them. They're in the streets. We take care of our people. Great, cradle to grave security. Who is this woman, this foul woman? We got a price on her head. And burn her books. As you asked, did she write other books? You bet. They never, ever. You know, sometimes you're a one-hit wonder. No, you are. Sometimes you got it right once. You're a one-hit wonder. Right? I used to coach baseball. I was a one-hit wonder one time. I knew I could never do it again. But I did it that one time. I never had to prove it. All I did was throw the bat down and say, this is what you want to do, fellas. And what I did was, it's tough to teach hitting. Hitting is difficult. Hitting is difficult. I said, fellas, watch this. This is how you hit. I pulled it off once. I kind of dug in. You keep your back foot still, all right? Put the helmet on. I said, fellas, this is how you do it. Watch this. I'm going to model hitting. So I had my best pitcher throw, and I hit his second pitch 365 feet over the left center field fence. I could never do that again. I could never do it again. And all I did was I threw the bat down, and I said, I'd made my case. And I said, how did I pull that off, right? So listen to me. This is how you hit. I could never do that again. But I'm so proud of myself. I was literally a one-hit wonder. We love our slaves. You know, we take care of them, cradle to grave. And their workload, you witch of a woman, you never understood this. You were on a Kentucky plantation. You didn't see the whole picture, the whole story, the big picture. You just took a piece of something you know nothing about. You live in Vermont. Who lives in Vermont? Cows. Cows. Nobody lives in Vermont. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And they're all squishy. They don't think straight. They don't vote straight either. Our workload. A young lad, a young girl, when she comes of age, working age, she is a quarter hand. They put a fraction on it. She's a quarter hand. And she does small tasks. He does small tasks. And then they become a half hand when they're older. And then they become a full hand. They're in the field. Or maybe they're in the big house. You know, they're in the big house tending the family. And then as they get older, they become an auntie or an Uncle Tom. It goes the other way. It grafts the other way. Half hand, quarter hand. And we bury them on the plantation. You know, we bury them with their people. And they bury them over there. And their singing is beautiful. Now, Frederick Douglass, in that first biography said, these white guys get it all wrong. They think we're singing because we're happy. We're singing because we're singing about freedom. We're singing about the day of Jubilee. When we can go to the far side, the other's not the far side. When we can go to the other side. That's what we're singing about. And Frederick Douglass obviously was a contemporary of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And if you look at the photographs of Frederick Douglass, and I've done, this is what I do for a living, that he was never photographed smiling. And the reason is I do this deliberately, because I don't want people to think that I'm a former happy slave. I don't smile, ever, because that would lead people to believe I'm happy. I'm not happy. I escaped. And now I'm speaking about freedom in New Bedford, if you will, or wherever, New York or whatever. So she never realized that success again, but did she stir up things, really. And that war between the states, and that Fugitive Slave Act, and that slave power conspiracy, and the Dred Scott decision, as Lincoln's observation about the Dred Scott decision, he said it has all the morality of a decision made in a barroom. Slavery going national. Once a slave, always a slave. John Brown's raid. Now there's radical abolitionism. John Brown's raid was attributed, to her book, getting people worked up, agitated over slavery. And John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, doesn't it? And John Brown, all we've done is talk since 1830. And what we need to do is we need to make something happen. All you've done is talk from the lectern. Or right. But at least Stowe has raised that issue to a fever pitch among the readers. That it's the wrongness of it. And John Brown, what I need to do, I need to incite a slave rebellion. And in October of 1859, he and fellow conspirators, he took 3 or 4 of his sons with him, made an attempt. They made a successful attempt to get inside the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. And he said, when the word gets out along the slave grapevine, that they will like bees to the hive, they will come to the arsenal, and I will give them weapons, and there will be an insurrection throughout the South. And he asked Frederick Douglass, will you join us? And I'd like you to be president of the first slave nation, carved out of the slave empire below the Mason-Dixon line. You know what Douglass said? He said, "You are one crazy white boy. That is not going to happen. I'm not going to rat you out. But you are walking into a perfect steel trap. I won't rat you out." And some of the funding for that came out of the religious community in Boston. They were called the Secret Six. And they never were prosecuted, and nobody ever wanted to look too deeply as to who was behind this. And so for Douglass, this is not the way to go. It's persuasion, keep the Union together, and over time, we'll be able to persuade Southerners that free labor is much more productive than slave labor, that it is immoral to break up families and to sell them like property, and that we need to be one nation, not a divided nation. We cannot, as Lincoln again, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And that's why the election of 1860 was such an important election, because for many Southerners, and by the way, only about 5%, of the white South owned slaves, but the other 5% owned white skins. And at least you've got somebody below you, you see, that you can order around, boss around, and maybe purchase 1 or 2 slaves. The notion of Gone with the Wind and Tara, that was the exception. Most of the homesteads, one might own 3 or 4 slaves, and you worked with them in the field. So when you see Gone with the Wind, that's not the norm at all. I have a little thing I do with films, and I call it reel-to-reel history. And what was the real history, and how did Hollywood present it? You know, and one that I'm doing next week, it's High Noon, Gary Cooper. It's all about the Cold War. That's what it's all about, the Cold War. And he's alone, isn't he? And the United States is alone. It's a great film. The close is wonderful. And you look at the close and you break it down, and the only requirement is you need to see the film. Before you come to class, you need to see the film. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything to you. So I'm going to close with the good news here. There is no homework. There are no blue books, you know, and everyone gets an A+ for the day. However, maybe there's a question or an observation or something that I could expand on a little bit.
There's a guy, a French economist named Pinckney, who 2 years ago wrote a book called Capital. And he studied the economy of the U.S., France, and England over a 200-year period, starting in 17 something. And he said he distinguished wealth from income.
Okay.
Wealth is what you own. Income is what you make from what you own. And he said that in 1830, a third of the wealth in the South and the United States was the slave population.
Yes, yes. A slave, in today's money, if I can make that leap, the value of a slave in today's money was $24,000. I mean, that's a mid-size Toyota.
That's one slave.
Pardon me?
One slave.
Yeah, 24,000 bucks. And so that begs the question, do you beat to death an investment, income, and wealth? And so, but that question wasn't asked. It was the moral issue. And it was the moral issue, the Christian issue, the breaking up of families. And again, the close. Uncle Tom, a black Christ. You know, that I will give my life, I will give my blood, you know, to hope to redeem the nation from the sin of slavery. Do this in memory of me. Sacrifice yourself. You know, even Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, got a little religion. Lincoln was not a religious man. I mean, he never joined a church. At best, he was a deist. And a deist is in between. A deist is hedging his bets. He's in between an agnostic, and an agnostic is hedging his bets. You know, between an agnostic and, by the way, you can circle you can fill in any dot you like. I mean, an agnostic and an atheist. And a deist simply believes this, you know, that there is a Lord. He made the universe. But then he walked away. He walked away. It's up to you to get it right. And there's some wisdom there too. You know, don't look for a divine plan in the clouds. You know, it's up to you to get it right, and to work. And I'll get you in a second. And to work it out. And 24,000 bucks. So, and the most valued slave at that time, $1,400 in their money. A young female, 14 years age, a woman about to hit, beginning to hit puberty, and how many children can she provide for me, you know, without having to buy them on the market, and I can sell them. There were some breeders, you know, breeding children for the slave market, or for them, you know, to be able to extend their property. And these young women who were particularly, you know, fertile, I guess that's the word. It's an interesting word, isn't it? And that, you know, every 2 years have a child, that they receive the best clothing, the best food, and the least difficult labor. I don't want to lose the child in the field. So there you have it. And your thought, ma'am?
What are the other books in your series?
Oh gosh, let's see. I mentioned The Crucible, and I mentioned Uncle Tom's Cabin. We're doing that. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. I like to use Loose Change when you can find it. It's the early feminist movement in the 1960s. And the title is instructive. Loose Change. You know, women were acting and behaving much differently in 1965 and 1967. It was you know, becoming of age time for everybody. There are long-term lessons here, aren't there? And I don't use Moby Dick, it's just too much. What's the other one I use? Black Like Me. I use that novel. And and Richard writes his book in the 30s. Help me the title. Pardon me?
Invisible Man.
Yeah, The Invisible Man, right. And Native Son I use sometimes as well. So there's a range of books. And it's interesting. It's interesting. The book by, it just ran out of my head. It deals with nuclear war on the beach. On the beach by Neville Shute, sure, On the Beach. And what that's all about, you know, and the deep moral choice of a family with their child on the beach. And that's a tough call. That question. So there we have it. Somebody else, yes.
Did Stowe go into, I read the book so long ago.
Oh yeah, me too. Well, I read it 3 or 4 years ago. I reread it, but because I had to.
Did she go into the fact there were huge penalties for teaching?
Did she what, I'm sorry?
Did she go into the fact there were huge penalties for teaching slaves how to read and write?
No, she did not. No, but there were, yes, there were. It was against the law.
Right.
But folks did it anyway. You know, when women taught their house slaves how to read because they had to follow directions. And if I'm an owner, you know, and I want a carpenter or I want a well dug or I want a blacksmith, yeah, I need to teach you how to read to be able to read a blueprint. Frederick Douglass taught himself how to read. It began with his mistress, who was very benign, and then when her husband caught her teaching Frederick how to read, that he put an end to that. And then he learned how to read by the little white children he dealt with and teaching him letters. And from the letters, he learned to make small words and then larger words. And then moving to the north, yeah. You see, if you can read and you can write and you can do numbers, you're a free person. If you know when your birthday is, see, he never knew when his birthday was. This past August was the 200th birthday of Frederick Douglass. He didn't know. He just said, I think I was born sometime in 1818, you know, in August. He didn't know, because if you know your birthday, it makes you credible. You're a person, right? If you have a last name, it makes you a person. If you can read and write and cipher, it makes you a person. If you're ignorant of those skills, you are dependent. And to read gives you independence. And God forbid they get to read the Declaration of Independence. Holy smokes. And we don't want to do that. And in the religious services, the time and again, the minister or the owner, the admonition from Jesus, the Savior, the Redeemer, slaves, be obedient to your masters. And the more you suffer here, the greater your reward will be in heaven. And that's Karl Marx. Karl Marx said that's absolutely when Karl Marx talked about, you know, from each according to his needs and to each according to his ability, and talking about that the wealthy, the factory owners are telling you and the church, the more you suffer here, the greater your reward will be in the next life. Marx said that is absolutely false. That is a bourgeois capitalistic lie. That is false. That is to keep you under control. And we need to seize the means of production. To the barricades, to the barricades. He died in bed with his boots on. Let somebody else do the bleeding and the dying. It happens, doesn't it? Now here, if I were you, this is what I would do. Now you do it and you tell me about it. The propaganda of the deed. Do it. Don't talk about it. Do it. And that's John Brown. Do it. I'm tired of talking. We are going to incite a slave insurrection.
Yeah. Why
Now.
was that such a failure? Why was the John Brown's insurrection such a failure?
Oh, it was poorly planned.
Just
Poorly. I think he wanted to die. I think he wanted to get caught and hanged. And both of those happened, of course. And to be a martyr. And he was a martyr for many abolitionists in the North. That John Brown has sanctified the gallows as Jesus has sanctified the cross. That he's helping to redeem the nation from the sin of slavery. You get caught up in that stuff. You know, I know the way, the light, and the truth. That can bring the wrath of, I almost said the wrath of God. That can bring the wrath of the government down on you, can it? You know, and you got every federal agent in the country looking for you. Yeah, I mean, it was poorly planned.
wasn't he thinking that
He was thinking The word will get out through the slave grapevine. I'm in the arsenal. All you need to do is come. I'm going to hand the weapons out to you and go from plantation to plantation and slaughter people. And then we're going to have a new republic. And I'm going to invite Frederick Douglass to be the president of this new republic, or maybe several republics carved out of a slave South. Now that's a big thought, isn't it? The propaganda of the deed. You know who watched that hanging? Who was there at that hanging? John Wilkes Booth. And while he completely disagreed with the objectives, he agreed wholeheartedly with the boldness of it. How bold? A slave insurrection to try to take history and grab it by the shoulders and move it in another direction. The propaganda of the deed. So for John Wilkes Booth, this never went away. And if I can take, I got you. And if I can take out Lincoln, that for the Confederacy can snatch victory from the closing jaws of defeat. The propaganda of the deed. I do not approve of John Brown, but I approve of the boldness of it, the daring of it, the daring of it. Yes?
Was it Robert E. Lee who commanded the troops?
Yeah, it was Lee, and I'll tell you who else was there. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson was there, and Longstreet wasn't. Longstreet was from Georgia. Yeah, he was the captain too. And they got them all. They got them all.
One more thing. You suggested that Vermonters were squishy.
That the what?
Vermonters suggested that Vermonters were squishy, but didn't they declare...
Politically, they voted for Bernie Sanders. Who votes for Bernie Sanders unless you're 10 years old?
Wait a minute. Didn't they declare war on Nazi Germany 3 months before the rest of the United States?
Oh, I don't know.
That's true.
How do you know that?
I've read it.
Then it must be true. Everything that's printed is true.
You can look it up.
Vermont, who did? The state of Vermont?
You should know that. You should know
Did Franklin Roosevelt know that?
I don't know.
Probably not. There are more cows in Vermont. Cows don't vote. Okay, I'll look it up. I'll look it up. And by swishy, I mean politically. From New Hampshire is no longer New Hampshire. It's an island of Massachusetts.
Bernie had more votes in Carlisle than Hillary did, just so you know.
Who did?
Bernie did.
Get out.
No,
Didn't get my vote. But I don't live in Carlisle. What's in your drinking water, fellas? Huh?
we're all from Vermont originally.
Oh, all right, okay. See, it all goes back. It all goes back to the source of origin, doesn't it? Bernie Sanders got more votes oh, wow. Didn't get my vote. My vote went out to Ohio. I did a write-in. Okay? I'll see you all later. Thank you for your company.